This week at the Roundtable, we're joined by David Gibson and Dan Plumley with Adirondack Wild Friends of the Forest Preserve, a conservation group dedicated to protecting the Adirondack Park. Welcome, gentlemen. It's nice to have you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about a new report your group has put out that's highly critical of the state and Adirondack Park Agency and some recent decisions. But first, let's get your thoughts. You and some other environmental groups, just in the past few weeks, have come out in opposition to plans by the Saratoga and North Creek Railway to store hundreds of discarded oil tankers on rail lines in the Adirondacks. 300 to 500 tank cars, I guess, is what the rail company is saying, maybe put along tracks running from Saratoga to Newcomb. The rail company says the tanker cars are going to be empty so that there will be little, if any, risk to the environment. So is the concern environmental, or is it more the aesthetics of having these in the Adirondacks?
I think the concern that Dan and I have as for Adirondack Wild and what many other people have is for the Adirondacks in general. This is an Adirondack Park. This is the dead center of the Adirondack Park. And the company wants to store some of the most hazardous tank cars known in the center of the Adirondack Park, just a few miles from the Hudson River, a few miles from the High Peaks Wilderness area, and a few miles from the town of Newcomb, where hundreds and thousands of visitors are coming to Newcomb because of its wild natural beauty and because of the historic tourism potential in Newcomb. And what are they confronted with? They're confronted with a proposal of 500 old, used, somewhat empty oil cars, and that poses a real problem for the whole park as well as the town of Newcomb.
Is there an environmental concern?
Absolutely, there is an environmental concern because these won't be fully empty cars. They will be carrying some oil, and some of that crude could leak into neighboring wetlands. This area is not well protected. There could be damage to those cars, and ironically, this proposal is planning to set these cars next to new wilderness areas that the state just invested millions of dollars to protect. And so that juxtaposition within the Adirondack Park is really untenable.
The rail company owns the far end of the line up in Essex County, up near Tahawus, and so it says because it owns the rail line, it doesn't have to have the permission of the state or county to store these oil tankers there, that they can go ahead and do this, that they're basically just alerting everyone they plan to do this. But you disagree with that, you dispute that.
Absolutely. The rail line crosses Forest Preserve historically, and also in the Adirondack Park, new land use and development is regulated under the Adirondack Park Agency. This is clearly a new use that was never anticipated on this line previously. And it's not just the potential of what the company is stating, the 300 to 500 or so. The question is, what kind of slippery slope would this proposal lead to? What future decisions for additional cars that might have toxic materials in them might they decide to place in this kind of graveyard or temporary setting down the road? It's absolutely critical that the DEC and the Park Agency review this under their full authority and regulation.
And you've asked them to do so?
Yes, we wrote to the governor, Governor Cuomo, advising him that both his DEC and APA, as Dan suggests, have regulatory authority, and we cited those parts of the law which we thought applied. And we also note that Warren County, which had the only opportunity to ask questions of the Saratoga North Creek Railroad, is starting to ask very hard questions about how empty these cars are, how long they're going to be stored, and where and how they're going to be inspected.
And the reason these cars are going there is these will be outdated cars. New standards in Canada already, and soon over the next few years in the U.S. will make these cars obsolete, these DOT 111 tankers that haul the crude oil. And so they'll either sit there until they're retrofitted or probably sold off for scrap. So no one's sure how long they may sit there.
Sure, and we have no doubt it's a moneymaker for the railroad. The question is it good for the Adirondack Park, and is it good for the town of Newcomb and Minerva, as well as the environment of the Central Adirondacks, to store over 500 cars of this kind there for an indefinite period.
Spokespeople for both the DEC and the APA say that they are concerned and that they're looking into the legal issues here and the legalities. Are they moving fast enough, or are they doing enough, in your opinion?
Well, Warren County which controls the line to North Creek and owns it, are the people right now in the hot seat, because that Board of Supervisors is starting to ask the right questions of the company. And they have to re-sign a contract with the railroad next year. So they are in a position to say to the railroad, no, this is not an appropriate use. This was not foreseen when we signed a contract with you before, which was to haul waste rock out of Tahawus and to allow a tourist train to go from North Creek to Tahawus in the future. So they are in the position right now to say no to this, and I hope they do.
The railroads fall under federal supervision. So is this a case where people's hands may be tied when it comes to either Warren County or the DEC or the APA if this is under the federal authority?
There may be some federal jurisdiction here that we're looking at, but the primary focus right now is on Governor Cuomo. The Warren County has to do what it has to do, and they have the health and safety and the environmental concerns of their populace towards North Creek. But Governor Cuomo has the statewide perspective. He has the Adirondack Park in mind, and he's got to tell his agencies that this is important and you're going to focus on this.
And I know a number of environmental groups have called on the governor to step in here. Have you heard anything from the governor's office? Does it appear that he may do something here?
Governor Cuomo's staff have told Adirondack Wild that they are looking hard at this and they want more information. So we have sent them the information that we have, the regulatory jurisdiction that we believe the APA and the DEC have, and we have not heard back in a week or so.
I think it's important to mention that this is happening in the context of very serious issues dealing with the movement of crude oil across the country and literally across North America. And in addition to the concerns about the core of the Adirondack Park being used as a graveyard for these old tankers, which seems very inconsistent with the concept of a wildland park for New York State. We are also extremely concerned about the level of crude that's being moved from Canada along Lake Champlain in these cars that are dangerous, that have been proven dangerous, and that would really threaten not only communities alongside the tracks as a first concern, but also very, very vulnerable environmental resources like Lake Champlain.
And the concern for a few years now has been whether first responders were able to handle this, whether they'd be able to get to a spill in Lake Champlain or any part of the Adirondack Park if, God forbid, there was a derailment. Are the railroads, is the railroad in this case, Canadian Pacific, working better with environmentalists, with communities, with first responders to work out spill response plans? And are they easing some of the concerns that folks have had about this?
I think that I think that's in process, and I think evaluating it is going to take time, without a doubt.
And still concerns, though, because you're not only talking about millions of gallons of Bakken crude being moved now, as you mentioned, from Canada down through Plattsburgh along Lake Champlain and down to the Port of Albany, but the possibility of tar sands oil being added and the number of trains increasing in the coming months.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very serious issue for municipalities all along the railways across New York State, but especially here in the Adirondacks, where we have a legacy of environmental protection that we have to sustain.
A number of groups have called on the DEC to step in, saying that they do have the authority to declare this as a threat and a danger and take steps to stop the trains. Have you been among those calling for the DEC to do that?
We've been a part of a statewide coalition in conjunction with Earth Justice out of New York City, and are a part of the leading effort to raise these concerns, absolutely.
Your group has put out a report saying that the future of the 6 million acre Adirondack Park is seriously threatened by state government's overemphasis on economic development at the expense of environmental conservation. And the report says that the Adirondack Park is at a crossroad. That's the title of your report. You argue that the state DEC and APA are shirking their duties, their responsibilities when it comes to protecting the Adirondack wilderness and upholding the state constitution that mandates that the state keep the state forest preserve forever wild. What are some of the examples at the top of your list of where this has been happening?
Well, Tom, as you know, in 2011 and 2012, the Adirondack Park Agency permitted the Adirondack Club and Resort in Tupper Lake, which is over 600 units in a resource management area, the most protected private land classification in the Adirondack Park. And yet the APA never did a thorough wildlife study. They never concentrated the buildings around Mount Morris, the ski center, which made the most sense economically and in terms of bringing visitors and skiers together in a community clustered around the mountain. They allowed their developer to spread out the development all through the green zone, which is resource management. That was a real wake-up call to Adirondack Wild and to others. But Adirondack Wild took that as a starting point because we were part of that public hearing, and we recognized, because we were a new organization in 2010, we recognized that this was, over the course of 5 years, this has been a pattern, not just an isolated permit here and there, but there's a pattern of agencies not respecting their traditions and their laws and their past precedent, because the APA at one time really took a hard look at subdivisions like this, large subdivisions, and their staff did their utmost to concentrate development near existing infrastructure and to allow the vast majority of the backcountry to stay green for forestry and for backcountry recreation. That was no longer the case, and we wanted to present the pattern in this publication.
Were you not opposed to the project and trying to stop it from happening at all, but you wanted them to do further and more thorough environmental studies and scale down the size of the project?
We wanted the APA to seize on several alternatives that would have allowed plenty of development near the mountain, but would have reduced the amount of infrastructure, and not only preserve the environment around the mountain, including 4,000 acres of resource management, but lessen the cost to the developer of putting in 15 miles of new roads, water and sewer infrastructure. That makes sense. That's smart growth. And the APA didn't go there. And the APA should have a higher standard than that. And the whole purpose of this document is to show the state that they need to subscribe to the highest standards of environmental protection in this park.
Did it hurt that as a group you came in well into the process, several years in, where the argument could be made that it had been looked at for going on almost a decade, and that much of this had been covered, and that these questions that were being raised now were just trying to throw up roadblocks to keep the project from moving forward?
That perception was out there, but that's not actually what took place. The stalling in the project application period was largely as a result of the developer not coming through on timelines and information that was being requested by the agencies. It wasn't a roadblock by environmental groups. Also, the adjudicatory hearing process produced significant testimony that demonstrated that this project design was, as our expert testified, sprawl on steroids, and that conservation design principles that are actually in place in other areas of New York State outside of the Adirondack Park by local governments that want to preserve scenic resources and ecological integrity was needed here. And there were a number of issues of that project that we can't get into, but the bottom line is what we are demonstrating in this report, not only with the ACR development approval, which was 10-1, vastly different from what the agency denied in the first 20 years of its existence. It wouldn't have allowed this kind of project to even see the light of day unless the developer was willing to produce a conservation design that really preserved the backcountry from the kind of sprawl proposal that they ended up approving. We identify case study by case study where the agency has walked backwards and basically degraded its legacy of good conservation approvals. And that's why we felt we had to write this report. It was panned by the DEC. It was given very short shrift, hoping it would go away, apparently by the APA and the governor's office. But there are 40 pages of case studies here. There are facts that we've seen over the last 2 years. We've put them in a cumulative report. And what's important, we've identified some 13 critical recommendations that this governor can take that would benefit the economy as well as the environment going forward. And if the Adirondack Park can't go after a progressive critical agenda like that to sustain our wild character and the resources that provide the people of New York State and our residents so much, where can we do it?
You mentioned Governor Cuomo. In the past few years, we've heard a number of people say that it seems environmental groups and economic developers have sort of had not a meeting of the minds, but have been working together in unison. Has there really been a push within the past 5-10 years to place more of an emphasis on economic development in the Adirondack Park, and do you think that's been a mistake?
There's nothing wrong with economic community development in the Adirondack Park, any rural area.
It's needed.
It's needed
for the communities.
It's important. But what has happened in the last few years is that environmental laws have been placed in a secondary role. Now, the Adirondack Park Agency Act, as well as the Department of Environmental Conservation's laws pertaining to the park, say natural resources should come first, not second. And whether it be the reaction to Hurricane Irene, when streams were bulldozed inappropriately for a month, all to the Adirondack Club and Resort, to the issuance of a permit for Nyco Minerals to explore drilling without even so much as an environmental impact statement up here in the town of Lewis. These are just a few of the examples. There was another permit issued this past January for 26 lots in resource management. Not a single wildlife study was done to show what was actually living and growing there, so that you can, as Dan is saying, reduce the environmental impacts, avoid environmental impacts, instead of mitigating after the fact environmental problems. So these are all a pattern of saying natural resources are important but secondary to someone's development permit. Well, we disagree. We think the whole park's economy runs well when you have a protected environment.
No, you mentioned Tropical Storm Irene and also Nyco Minerals. After Tropical Storm Irene 4 years ago in 2011, Johnsburg in Keene was one example of where heavy equipment was brought in to remove a lot of the debris left behind by the flooding, and there was immediate concern what that was going to do to fish habitat, but also the potential to create other flooding problems the way that that work was done.
That's right. Well, that was empowered by the governor's decision to basically set regulatory authority aside for a period of time to allow for the cleanup, and that allowed for unregulated activity in our rivers and streams, some of which was extremely damaging and not utilizing the best principles for stream and river restoration. Fortunately, after several weeks, we were able to convince the governor and the DEC to require investigating river restoration techniques that actually work with the way the river and stream ecology and system works. And so
a number of environmental watchdogs raised their voice and objected to that. In response to that, have corrections been made? And
yes, I think the Cuomo administration deserves credit for recognizing the concerns that we placed at that time, and to being supportive at the state and county level to both educate people who are working with the streams and restoration projects, and also to help facilitate grant monies to restore some of those damaged stretches.
And you mentioned Nyco Minerals. In recent weeks, we've heard that there have been a number of concerns raised about the involvement of the DEC in that project and the constitutional amendment that was approved by voters in the fall of 2013.
Yes, I mean, for the first time in our memory and to our knowledge, the state DEC became an advocate for a constitutional amendment to the Forever Wild Clause, and really lobbied hard for passage, two different passage in the state legislature, and lobbied members of the legislature very hard. Now, normally DEC doesn't do that, and we've, during our 30 years in this work, DEC has been produced facts about constitutional amendments that have been proposed by a member of the legislature. For example, Senator Stafford or Senator Little would have a proposal, and the DEC would be in a fact-finding mode. In this case, they were full steam ahead. We want this passed. We think it's good for the economy, good for jobs. And yes, I think they were inappropriate in that activity. But more importantly, Article 14 came out the loser. The integrity of that article, where for the convenience of a private corporation, Article 14 was amended, and not for the broad public benefit.
There had been land swaps before. What was the difference here?
Well, again, from our point of view, it was that this swap was for the convenience of an international mining company, not for the broad public benefit. For example, there have been land swaps so that a town could improve their water supply under EPA order on the Clean Drinking Water Act. They had to act, and we had to agree to a land swap in Racket Lake, for example, that allowed that town, that village, to get clean water and to swap Forest Preserve as a result. That's an example of a land swap that makes complete sense for the Forest Preserve and for the community.
International company, but a number of the proponents made the argument that 100 jobs in Essex County depended on this.
Yes, and those jobs will continue because the company has at least a 25-year supply of willastonite on their own lands. They didn't have to go to Lot 8, which was adjoining to their open pit mine, to get that mineral. They have a reserve, and the state should have said, work on your own reserves, because they have permits to do that work.
Lot 8 is the 200 acres that will be swapped for about 1,500 acres in the J Mountain Wilderness area. The state said that the 200 acres in question here weren't that remarkable. I think it may have been not the exact words, but something to that effect.
Yep.
And that the exchange would benefit the Forest Preserve by bringing in some diverse land in another part of the J Mountain Wilderness.
That's a very controversial issue, point on that issue, because in fact those 200 acres were first protected by the state after the Forever Wild Act was established in 1885. So these are some of the oldest Forest Preserve forests, northern hardwood forest ecosystems in the park. I've spent many times on that site. There's significant patch old growth. There's tremendous water resources on the site, vernal pools, hibernia for amphibians and salamanders, very critical to the upland ecosystem there. It's significant black bear habitat. And all of these factors that we're talking about were not even recognized by the DEC. That demonstrates one of the key concerns that we have, not only associated with decisions about the DEC and APA are making on the Forest Preserve, but again, as Dave discussed with ACR, the lack of scientific studies and analysis necessary to really know where some of these permit approvals are taking the land and the resources of the park. And that's especially critical in the resource management category, which serves as a buffer to wildlands. You know, we talk about the NICO issue, and you asked the question, why was it different? Well, one of the big reasons it was different was because of the fact that for the first time in the history of the Forest Preserve, the state of New York allowed roads to be built and mineral exploration on Forest Preserve lands while it is still designated wilderness. That is a sad fact of this decision. And it's one that we identify here. Yes, we recognize that it passed by the people of New York State. We weren't trying to change that fact. But one of our key recommendations is to strengthen the process, the review process, to better safeguard the Forest Preserve from these kinds of amendments, which are wholly inconsistent with the legacy and history of New York State for the Constitution.
NICO is doing testing on that lot now. No decision's been made on whether
they have completed the testing. They drilled 8 test wells, fewer than they had planned. They cut a few miles of roads through the wilderness, and they apparently have found a sufficient amount of ore that they're interested in. We don't yet know the findings. It's being reviewed by DEC at this time.
Is your group or any others considering any further challenge to it?
I think right now our organization, along with a coalition of organizations, are primarily focused on how the state will evaluate the findings of NICO, and how the state actually plans to go forward if they intend to go with a land swap. How do you value the land if it has potentially hundreds of millions of dollars of ore underneath? How does the state value that in terms of getting a fair deal if the swap is going to go forward? That's never been done before regarding subterranean mineral resources under forever wild wilderness lands. It's going to be a very interesting case, and we want to make sure that the state doesn't lose second time around.
Because it has to be of equal value or greater value. Do you question whether the 1,500 acres that is being swapped meets that criteria?
Well, of course we do, because they don't own it, and they haven't bought it yet, and so we don't know what we're getting truly. And many of those lands are cut over, timbered lands of definitely lower value than the kind of ecosystem that was heretofore undisturbed on Lot 8.
In recent weeks, the state has opened trails in the Essex Chain Lakes region that the state purchased from the Nature Conservancy, a former Finch Pine timberland, and open to hiking and biking, and just a beautiful, beautiful area. Concerns, though, by some groups, including yours, about whether in the creation of snowmobile trails throughout that area, that's going to open this pristine land to too much motorized traffic.
It is a wonderful landscape, Tom, as you said. It has just great resources on it. And to open it to the public, as Governor Cuomo did in 2012, 2013, is a wonderful thing. And our founder, Paul Schaefer, protected that area from the Gooley Dam, which would have flooded the Essex Chain and all the way up to Newcomb. So this has a long tradition of citizen concern and involvement. And we got behind a wilderness classification. That didn't happen, but the APA classified it as primitive, so that the chain of lakes, being very sensitive water bodies, are managed as if they were wilderness under a primitive classification, out of concern for their water quality and the fisheries, for example. And then what happened was that the governor invited certain people to get together to talk about motorized routes through the area. Mm-hmm. And out of those discussions came snowmobile wild forest corridors that cut through the heart of wilderness on one side, the Hudson River, and the Essex Chain primitive area on the other side, and you have these long snowmobile corridors, wild forest. But in order to create those corridors, the governor also has told his agencies that 2 bridges are needed to connect snowmobiling to wild country to the east, the Vanderwacker Wild Forest. So you have to cross the Cedar River from Indian Lake and build a 110-foot steel bridge there for snowmobiling. And then you have to use the Polaris Bridge on the upper Hudson to go east into the Vanderwacker Wild Forest. Well, the Vanderwacker Wild Forest is a undeveloped, beautiful wild forest protected by Article 14. There's no need to create new corridors in that direction. You can go straight up past the Good No Flow and go right to Newcomb. And if snowmobilers want to connect Indian Lake to Newcomb, it's doable. But unfortunately, the Wild, Scenic, and Recreational Rivers Act is being ignored, because you cannot create motorized bridges across these 2 scenic rivers, the Cedar and the Hudson, without violating the state's own regulations. And so far, the state is saying, to heck with our regulations. We'll just issue ourselves a permit. Well, that's not the kind of standards that we think deserve to be in the Adirondack Park. And so we are challenging the department and saying, no, your unit management plan is legally defective in a number of areas, and it needs to respect your own Wild Rivers Act and regulations.
So you're saying the snowmobile trails can still exist. This network that they've been trying to create to connect Indian Lake and Newcomb and Minerva can still exist, and they can receive the economic benefit. You just believe it should be rerouted differently.
There's a snowmobile network in this park, Tom, that's immense. It's thousands of miles. And there's an existing connector right now from Indian Lake to Newcomb, which snowmobilers are using. But again, the alternatives aren't discussed in the unit management plan. The DEC has an obligation to the public to say these are the alternative ways that snowmobiles can get from one community to another. Well, the UMP leaves out that existing alternative right now. So what are we going to do with alternatives that don't have the damaging impact that will be created by building one new steel bridge, 110 foot long, and maintaining it forever, and motorizing a new area called the Van der Wacker Wild Forest that has no motorized use right now, that is forever wild, and that would require cutting thousands of trees. So we're saying use the alternatives that you have today, evaluate them, and see if we can live with those routes today that don't cause so much damage.
Snowmobiles in the winter, are you concerned there would be a push for to allow ATVs to use it in other seasons?
Yes, Dan and I have seen a number of areas in this park that are snowmobile trails, but have been turned into mud pits by all-terrain vehicles operating illegally in our forest preserve. And as the climate changes in this park, more and more of those motorized routes are going to be turned into 4- or 3-wheel access all season. And that utterly changes not only the ecology of a wetland, for example, because you can see the results of those tracks for years and years afterwards, but it changes the wild integrity of this park.
What are some of the recommendations you make in your report?
Well, regarding ATVs, we've recommended for a long time, and we include it here, that the governor needs to bite the bullet and write a policy that prohibits all-terrain vehicles on the forest preserve. It is not an appropriate use of forever wild lands, and it's long past time that should be done. Again, I want to go back to utilizing science, and we see decisions based on kind of political interest, open for business ideology, where of course we support economic development. We live here, we work here, we raise families here. We appreciate that, but we have to see the standards meet the test of a wild Adirondack park, especially where it's the environment and it's the natural resource base, it's scenic and ecological quality that provides the economic base for so many of the towns and communities in the park. So we are recommending a higher standard that actually allows environmental conservation to work hand in hand with economic development in the most prudent way. That's why we can be a model internationally. That's why we were recognized in 1989 as a biosphere reserve, unique around the world. Those are concepts that countries and protected areas around the world are looking at the Adirondack Park, are coming here to learn about, and we don't want to step down and not live up to the standard that we've led in the past. It's absolutely critical.
And this is the first of two reports. The first part, the second part is coming out in a few months, and what's that going to cover?
We're not setting a timetable yet. We're finding it challenging enough
down the road
to get this report out there. Yep. And also to make sure that the recommendations Dan talks about are fully explained in public settings, and that's our mission right now. Part 2 is going to come, but it's going to come more slowly than we predicted. But clearly, the state is not the only actor here. Local communities in this park have so much to do with protecting the environment, planning their future. Each town in this park has a role to play in envisioning a future where its wildlands are protected and its wildlife integrity and the integrity of those wildlands are protected while they make progress as a community.
So not only communities, but landowners and
as Dan is saying,
stakeholders.
Each community can define, can use science and use scientific tools to evaluate their own landscape and work with an APA to create a special plan for their community. But the APA needs to come back and say to them, no, we have a new law that says the default mechanism for your subdivision here is a conservation design. And so we want to see new legislation in Albany that says to the APA, when you're faced with a big subdivision, you are going to use these principles called conservation design of development. And that uses a lot of science and natural resource investigation up front, right at the earlier start of evaluating the subdivision or the project, rather than later. Because if you do it up front, then you know what organisms you're talking about, what is sensitive, what is not, and also you reduce the costs of the development.
So will it require legislative?
We think that the APA has the power, and we document many instances in here where the APA used a sort of conservation design for 25 to 30 years because their staff believed in their law and worked hard to, with developers to say, no, you can't do it that way. Here is one way we want you to do it and work with us, instead of just saying, here's the rubber stamp. So we think the APA could do that on their own. Unfortunately, we're not seeing it. We've been 5 years now into this administration, and so far the APA is not requiring conservation design or development. And so we think the next step is for the legislature to tell them, you have no choice.
Do you have supporters in the legislature who will back you, or is that going to be a tough go finding enough lawmakers to support that?
We think we do, Tom, because the leaders of the Assembly and the Senate see in their own home places, their own districts, the difference between smart growth and not smart growth. And they can point to examples in their own districts where intelligent assessment of natural resources was done, impacts were avoided, and yet a significant project was developed which avoided sensitive areas. So they know that, and they appreciate that, and they say, well, this is the Adirondack Park, surely you can do it there. Last year we sat at this table, Tom, with you and talked about the Wilderness Anniversary. It was the 50th anniversary since the National Wilderness Act was passed by Congress in 1964. And a year later, I think our big question, and one of the questions we're posing, and we're getting this out to the public, is, in 50 years, will there be an Adirondack wilderness worthy of the name? And I think we have to think now and take steps now to ensure that there will be. And so we've come out of last year inspired, but also recommitting ourselves to re-energize New Yorkers as advocates for this park. I think there's a rejuvenation of a sense of ownership of this park. Everyone is a taxpayer of the Forest Preserve, but even more so, even if you don't hike, paddle, snowmobile, or horse ride in this park, you have a stake in the future of this park. And I think that's the lesson coming out of the Wilderness Anniversaries, that we have to redouble our efforts as advocates for this region.
A number of environmental groups are calling on the state to consider reintroducing both the eastern gray wolf and cougars, mountain lions, to the Adirondacks. They roamed the Adirondacks a century and a half ago, and a number of groups think that among the many other species that the state manages, that they ought to bring those species back. Do you support that?
Well, Adirondack Wild supports scientific studies to assess the viability of the Adirondack habitat for wolves and cougars as top predators, as keystone animals critical to the ecosystem. And it's been some almost 30 years now since anyone has done a study. The Defenders of Wildlife did a study in the late 80s. I think, along with the needed scientific studies on the ecological role of these incredible animals and the habitat for them, which has only increased over the last 30 years. The critical aspect of the study is the sense of the population, the people who live here, and the people of New York State on whether or not to consider reintroduction programs or natural restoration, connections with Algonquin National Park, for example, in Canada. You know, there's a lot of debate scientifically about viability and the success of restoration programs. We've seen many successes in Yellowstone, We have to learn from those, and also we have to understand the Adirondack context. So we feel it should be looked at and investigated. We also believe, frankly, that there is a significant shift in public interest in top predators. There's been a lot of science demonstrating their ecological value that benefits sportsmen, that benefits river ecosystems, that benefits what's called trophic cascades, making the ecosystem more sustainable. The fact that we have the landscape where we might be able to achieve this is incredible, because most of the United States, you don't have that opportunity. So of course we should look at it, and we support investigating it.
The state tried with lynx about 25, 30 years ago, and that failed. Should that give pause to considering the same for wolves and cougars?
You know, I don't think so. One project's failure, I don't think should impose anything upon current studies. The habitat, we've added significant habitats to the wildlands of the park over the last 25, 30 years, and you know, those are questions that require more study.
All right. Dan Plumley, Dave Gibson, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. The Adirondack Park at a Crossroad, a Roadmap for Action is the report. You can find it at adirondackwild.org. And once again, Dan and Dave, thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you, Tom.